In 1888, there was a Swedish chemist by the name of Alfred Nobel. Picked up a newspaper to read, and then he quickly put it back down. The reason he put it back down was he was reading the obituary section, and there was an ominous headline, "The Merchant of Death is dead." And then he came across this line in the newspaper: Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. How would you feel reading your own obituary in the newspaper? Well, clearly a mistake was made. It turns out that his brother Ludwig had recently passed away. Probably that's the reason that he was reading this section. Going to read what they say about old brother Ludwig. And turns out he finds an obituary written about him. And so a mistake was made. They thought he was his brother was him. And so he's reading this obituary, clearly a mistake. But what was not a mistake, what wasn't a mistake, was the facts about his fortune. As a chemist, he spent his life developing patents and inventions and getting them patented. Had 355 patents in his lifetime. He's most famous for inventing dynamite. But these other patents, the vast majority of them were focused on killing more people faster. How would you have felt if you were Alfred Nobel in this situation and you came across the same thing? How would you feel if you were to read your own obituary and it was negative about your life? Even far more importantly than that, how would you feel standing before God if the assessment was not good? So these are things that we've got to think about if we want to live a life that counts, a life that counts for eternity. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to live, what it looks like to live a life that counts eternally. This is something that God has put inside of your heart. This is something that He's made you want to do. It's like that prayer of Moses in Psalm 90. Lord, establish the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. Don't you want to put your hand to something meaningful? Do you really just want to build sandcastles that are washed away with the next tide, and that's the meaning of your life work? God knows that it's in your heart to want to do something that matters, that's significant, and that lasts eternally, and He gives us that opportunity. That's what we're going to talk about today, is how to do that. And God actually wants that for your life. And we're in a series right now. It's the last week of this series. The series is called True Riches. True Riches. We're looking at what does it look like to be wealthy in God's eyes, not just the world's eyes, because that's one measure. Because remember, we're living for someone else's eyes, right? We're living for Him. So what are true riches? That phrase is actually one that will arise in today's passage. This is our third week in a row to be in the book of Luke. And of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Luke mentions wealth more than any other Gospel writer. Far more. In fact, he has 6 parables that all begin with a certain rich man. And today's parable is no different. It's often called the parable of the dishonest steward. You ever heard of that parable before? Anybody? The parable of the dishonest steward. It's an interesting parable. It's probably one of the hardest parables of Jesus, but fascinating and inspiring. And I'm confident that by the end of our time together, you'll understand what God's message is through this parable. You'll understand what it looks like to be wealthy in God's eyes and how to live a life that counts for eternity. And so, why don't we turn to Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16. I'll read the text and then we will unpack it. Luke 16. Here is what Jesus says. He's talking to His disciples. He said to His disciples, this is verse 1, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, Since my master is taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down, and write 50. He said to another, 'How much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own?'" Okay, so do you have some questions as we were reading through that text? Some strange words and phrases. We'll get to all of those. The good news is that with this parable, unlike some of Jesus' parables, there's actually an explanation that goes with it. The first 8 verses are the parable itself. The last kind of 8th verse, halfway through verse 13, is actually the end of Jesus' explanation. But Jesus will go on. He'll be talking about money all the way through the end of chapter 16. But our approach this morning is we're going to really look first at the parable. What is the meaning? What is the main message of the parable? And then we'll look at Jesus' explanation of the parable, which is going to expound upon the practicalities of what it looks like to live a life that counts. So let's start with what is the main theme of the parable. I'll tell you first, and then I'll show you in the passage. The main theme of the parable is stewardship. Stewardship. You ever heard that word before? Stewardship. Okay, and now let me show you in the passage. Verse 1, we meet the two main characters. There's a rich man, and there's a manager. A rich man and a manager. So parables are symbolic. So the question is, who do you think the rich man symbolizes? Shout it out. God. You guys are theologians. Okay, so the rich man is God. That's right. Now, who do you think is the dishonest manager? Us. You're like, it's not very flattering, right? But, okay, so God's the rich man. We are his money managers. There's some interesting implications for this, and one of them is that it doesn't matter how rich you are. You're not the rich man. It doesn't matter how rich you are. I mean, Jeff Bezos, he's the richest man in the world, has billions of dollars, but he's not the rich man. He's just managing God's money, okay? So, in fact, you and Jeff Bezos actually have the same net worth. Did you know that? $0. So these are some of the implications of this. Jeff Bezos might manage more of God's money than you manage, but he has the same net worth. Okay, and so God is the rich man. We are his money managers. Let's dive a little bit more deeply into that word manager. Okay, into that word manager. Now, some of your translations, if you're reading from like a New King James Version or something like that, it'll translate this word as steward. The word steward appears 3 times in the 8 verses of the parable. A variation of that word, steward or manager. A variation of that word, stewardship or management, appears 3 more times. And so we have 6 usages of the same word, slight variations, but of the same word, 6 usages in 8 verses. Stewardship is the theme of this parable. And a lot of times, that's important to say, a lot of times people read parables and they get so into the details of things that they're exploring certain meanings. It's like, just what is the main point of the parable? That's how you read a parable. What is the main point? Jesus is talking about stewardship. Now, if you want to live the life that counts, you have to know what a steward is, and you have to live the life of a steward. So what is a steward? Okay, what is a steward? I think to illustrate this, it'd be best to illustrate this and to put a little contrast here. The best way to understand stewardship is the difference between stewardship and ownership. Okay? Because remember, the rich man, he owns the stuff. The manager, who's us, we manage the stuff. So stewardship versus ownership. So let me illustrate the difference between that. I need, I don't know, does anyone use pencils anymore? Does anyone in the audience have a pencil I could borrow? Okay, Allison has a pencil. All right, look at this. Beautiful number 2, made from the cedars of Lebanon. Okay, so we're illustrating the difference between stewardship and management. Thank you. Why don't you guys give Allison a hand for loaning her pencil. So I'm going to take this beautiful pencil and I'm going to destroy it. I don't know, why are you guys reacting so much? What's the big deal? I can destroy the pencil if I want, right? Well, not really, because it's hers, right? You're laughing because it's, exactly. You're laughing because it's Allison's pencil. And I'm not allowed to do whatever I please with someone else's stuff. Okay, now what if I was to tell you that, and maybe you discerned this because you're so smart, okay? Maybe you discerned that Michael planted the pencil, and it actually belonged to Michael, and he gave it to Allison before the service. Does that change things a little bit? It changes things because I can do whatever I want with my own pencil, right? I can destroy my own, and it's like that with all possessions, right? If I buy a car, I mean, if I want to, I can run it into walls. Like, oh, it's so much fun. I mean, you'd call me foolish for doing that, but I can do it because it's, in a sense, right, my own. Okay? But if I borrow your car, how are you going to feel about it? If I borrow your car, it's a very different story. And this is what highlights the difference between stewardship and ownership. Ownership means we do what we please with our own money. Stewardship means we do what God pleases with God's money. Let me say that again. Ownership means we do what we please with our money. Stewardship means we do what God pleases with God's money. And God says the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to Him. God says the silver and the gold are mine. God says the watch on your wrist, the car you drove to church, everything you own is actually His. He's the rich man. We're the money managers. And just like this money manager, this steward in verse 2, one day we're going to answer to the rich man. One day all of us will give an account for our accounting. We're going to have a conversation with God about the way we used our money. More like God's going to tell us what He thinks about it. And what would He say to you? This is something that if you fear the Lord and if you love the Lord, you'll think about this before it happens, not when it happens. One day all of us will give an account for our accounting. I've been a pastor for long enough to know that for some of us, that might be deflating. You might feel hopeless right now, considering that, because maybe you came this morning and your finances are all upside down. Or maybe you've attended a stewardship class at church and they talked about 401ks and college savings plans and emergency funds and diversification of assets and all of these financial terms, and you're like, what's the difference between debit and credit? You're like taking out your calculator when you go to a restaurant, like, okay, what's the tip again? Like maybe you're not a numbers person, and maybe you're not a math person, and you hear this, like, I'm going to stand before God, and He's going to talk to me about my finances, and like, I'm good at English. Not finance. And so I want to encourage you this morning, if that's the position that you're coming from. I want to encourage you with this question: what if I was to tell you that stewardship is not about being a financial genius? What if I was to tell you stewardship was not about being a financial genius? And I'm saying this as a finance guy. I mean, that was my degree in college. I started my career as a financial analyst, and that's my language. And 401ks and diversification of assets. Like, I know what all that means, and I get it, and I see the value of those, and I actually even see the way those play into the stewardship conversation under normal circumstances. But we have to say, under normal circumstances. And the reason we have to say it that way is that in 2 chapters, in Luke chapter 18, Jesus is going to be in a conversation with a really, really rich guy, okay? Who doesn't understand that his riches are not his own. He's going to have a conversation with this guy, and Jesus is going to tell him, sell everything, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. And he wouldn't do it. This guy was standing before God in the flesh, God of the universe, and he held on to his 401k. Let me ask you, was he being a good steward? Because he held on to his 401k? You see, sometimes I think where we miss it is if we have a stewardship class in a church and we talk about all the financial ins and outs, and that's great, they're important, they're good, but what it's really about is what will please God. In the context of Luke 18 with that rich young ruler I just told you about. And in the context of this parable that we just read, stewardship is measured by generosity. Stewardship is measured by generosity. And you say, well, what about all those things you said? And savings and investments and all of those. Again, I would say under normal circumstances, those are a good and important part of stewardship. The purpose of savings is to save you from debt. The purpose of investment is to maximize long-term earnings. But the ultimate purpose of both of these is to enable you. Let me tell you this. The purpose of both of these is not to enable you. We saw this a few weeks ago, not the rich young ruler, the parable of the rich fool. Were some of you guys here for that? Remember Luke chapter 12? This dude's got massive savings and he's using it so he can eat, drink, and be merry. The purpose of savings investment is not so you can live high on the hog till you're 87. The purpose ultimately, the ultimate purpose is that God might enable you to have the joy of being a lifelong lavish giver. What if you were 87 years old continuing to give lavishly? Because God isn't just interested in, you came to church, preacher said, a motivating sermon, you gave to his campaign or whatever it is, he was raising money for, and you sacrificed a lot, but then you don't give again. God's looking for lifelong generosity because the God we worship at the core of his being is he is a giver. He gave his son. Jesus gave his life. The Father and the Son give the Holy Spirit as a gift to us. We have a giving God, and in response we give. And God wants to invite us into the joy of the triune God by being givers, cheerful givers ourselves. So the degree to which savings and investment are important, and they matter, is that they're ultimately driving toward generosity, because you will not stand before God and he's going to say, how much did you have in your 401k again? How much did you have saved up? He's not going to ask that. The one thing he's looking at, the only thing he's looking at is generosity. And the other things feed into that. They're good, they're important, but they feed into that, generosity. Stewardship is measured by generosity. And here's why that's good news. The reason that's good news is you don't need to be a financial genius to be financially generous, do you? You don't need to be a genius to be generous. A few chapters after that, Luke chapter 21, you remember the woman who gives her final 2 coins? You remember her? She gives her last 2 coins, all she has to live on. And Jesus praises her. Why? Because she's a certified public accountant? She just really gets it? He praises her for generosity. And the good news is that whether you are poor or you are rich, you can always be generous. God isn't measuring you with what you start with or how much money you amass or anything. All He's looking at is generosity. Poor or rich, you can do that. You have the power. You have the grace to please God in this area of your life, whether you're good at English and not math or whatever, because you don't need to be a genius. You just need to be generous. Okay, so summarizing what we've said so far, ownership is doing what we please with our money. Stewardship is doing what God pleases with God's money. And since it is all God's money, we're in the steward category. Okay, and so we want to use our money in such a way that God is pleased with us when we stand before Him, when we give an account before our accounting. And so God's measuring our generosity. That's what He's looking at. Now I want to ask one of the hard questions of the parable. I want to ask one of the hard questions of the parable, probably the most debated of them all. I'll ask it as soon as I get this sip. My wife always tells me, like, you take such prominent drinks from water whenever you're on the stage. And I'm like, no, I don't. Okay. So here's the question. Why does the steward receive praise? Why does the steward receive praise? Was that a question that popped up in your mind? I mean, you're talking about a guy that in verse 1, he wastes the master's possessions. And that word for waste or squander in some translations is the same one in Luke chapter 15 where it's talking about the prodigal son who inherits his father's wealth and squanders it on wild living. Becomes a party animal to such a degree he wastes everything. That's the same word used here. We might have called this the parable of the prodigal steward. And so he wastes everything, and then, like as if he hadn't learned his lesson, finds out he's about to lose his job, and then he just starts giving his master's money away. Tell people, diminishing their debts, and people who understand exchange rates of like ancient world, they tell me that it was the equivalent of about each person getting 2 years worth of income or two years worth of debt just kind of canceled. And so why is this guy getting praised? I mean, if anything, he should go to jail, right? Like, you didn't ask the master first, you didn't ask him, you just up and decided to give these people money after you'd already, like, you've twice wasted this guy's money, and then the master comes in, he's like, good job. I mean, you're like, wait, what? The kind of biblical scholarship that kind of looks into this, the way some of them handle it is they try to make this scoundrel of a human not so scoundrelly, right? They try to make him a better guy. And so they'll say things like, well, he was just, the people were getting charged exorbitantly, so he just made it more reasonable. Or he just shaved off his commission, and out of the generosity of his heart, he gave away his commission to bless his master. And that's not the point of the parable. Jesus is actually trying to show us this dude was a scoundrel. Okay, and the key, in fact, he even uses the words in verse 8, calls him the dishonest manager. Okay, so the point of the parable is not, well, he was actually a good guy, he just doesn't look like it. That doesn't pass the smell test, does it? Okay, so the key to understanding why is this steward praised is to pay attention to what he's praised for in verse 8. What's he praised for? Does Jesus say, good job being so dishonest? He's not praised for his dishonesty, he's praised for his shrewdness. He's shrewd. That's not a word we often use these days, is it? What does it mean to be shrewd? It means to be prudent or wise, but really the closest thing I think in sort of colloquial, everyday terms would be the word or the phrase street smart. You know what it is to be street smart, right? Like this guy, like we don't know how good he was at QuickBooks, but he was street smart. He understood that people like free money. And I'm about to be out of a job. And so what a street smart person does is they understand how the world works, and then they use it to their advantage. They understand how the world works, and they use it to their advantage. And when Jesus makes that contrast in verse 8, where he says, the sons of this age, or the sons of this world, talking about unbelievers, They're more shrewd than the sons of light. That is, believers. He's actually saying, in this thing, you should actually take your cues from the world. Just like we saw last week, Jesus points us to the ravens and the lilies. We should take our cues from them. This week, he says, on this particular issue, in the area of shrewdness, the world understands how money works, and they use it to their advantage. And the world does do this all the time, don't they? A wealthy company, if they don't have much in the way of ethics, might try to bribe public officials, judges, and legislators to get favorable laws and favorable sentences. Wealthy individuals might use their wealth to buy good press, or in some cases, silence. Or it even happens in churches where sometimes the richest guy in church, who's basically funding the pastor's salary and the building and all of this, well, guess who's really leading that church? It's not the pastor, it's not the elders, it's the rich guy, and he's using his money to control people. This is what the world does, and it's why Jesus calls it in verse 9 unrighteous wealth. He's not saying that money in and of itself is an evil thing. It's not. It's a neutral thing. But money is often used for evil purposes. So what Jesus is saying, putting all of this together, he's saying, don't be unrighteous like the world, but do be street smart like the world. You see that? Don't be unrighteous like the world, but do be street smart like the world. That is, use money for your own advantage. Think about that. He's saying use money, but not just for your earthly advantage like the rest of the world. Use it for your eternal advantage. And he begins to turn this into how we live a life that counts for eternity. He's actually giving you a self-motivation. He's actually telling you, do you want to maximize your eternal joy? You have the capability sitting in your pocket. Your finances are a part of that story, of how you maximize your eternal enjoyment of who God is. You say, well, what does that look like? So let's talk about that. We're going to shift now into the sort of last portion of the parable, from verse 9 to the end of the passage. And Jesus is going to point out two ways in which we, through our faithful stewardship, can impact our eternal future. And as we're talking about this, I want us to keep in mind a distinction between eternal salvation, which is a free gift, and eternal reward. Salvation, the gift, comes from Jesus' sacrifice. We just trust in Him. Eternal reward comes from your sacrifice, what you do for Jesus. And so that's going to come into play as we talk through faithful stewardship here. Okay, and so I'm going to make 2 points from this last section about what it really means and how Jesus expands upon you living a life that counts for eternity, me living a life that counts for eternity. And so here is the first point. Number one, faithful stewards make friendships that last forever. Faithful stewards make friendships that last forever. I think that's kind of cool. Because isn't this what life is really about? I mean, you've all read the studies. I mean, I've quoted in here to where I just stopped quoting them, but I guess here I go. So many studies, so one after another, where they show people who are the richest, people who are the smartest, people who are the most accomplished, people who've climbed to the top of the ladder, people who've done this, have that, all the things that the whole world is aspiring toward, none of them affect happiness. The happiest people on the planet are those with good, close friendships. Friendships are what life is all about, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. Life is about, first, friendship with God, and second, friendship with people. And in verse 9, Jesus is going to share an eternal reward. He's going to share with us how we increase our eternal joy in friendship. And so let's read the verse one more time, verse 9. He says, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth,
so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. I told you this was a hard parable. And this is a hard verse. Like, what in the world does it mean to make friends with our money that they might receive us into eternal dwellings? I mean, on the surface, what it sounds like, it almost sounds like he's saying that we can buy our way into heaven, just like this steward sort of bought his way into people's homes. Is that what God is saying? Well, we know off the bat that can't be what God is saying, because remember, who's the rich man and who's the money manager in this parable? God's the rich man, right? God is the only one with capacity to purchase our eternal salvation. 1 Corinthians 6, the Apostle Paul will say, "You are not your own, you were bought at a price. Therefore honor God with your body." So it's not just our money that's a stewardship. Our entire lives, like you don't own you. God owns you. God is the possessor of heaven and earth. He owns all things, including your pocketbook, including you yourself. God is the rich man. He's rich, not just in wealth, of course, but he's rich in all things. He's rich in mercy. He's rich in love. He's rich in kindness. So God's the rich man. And who are we in this parable? We're the dishonest steward. And I think it's actually good for us to just sort of let that sink in for a moment. Because it's not very flattering, right? Like, you read this parable and you're like, this guy's a scoundrel. And Jesus is like, this is you guys. So this guy, this prodigal steward, he is you and I. Because you and I have squandered what God has given us. All of us have, none of us have been perfectly faithful with our money. None of us have been perfectly faithful with our time, with our energy, with our relationships, with our networks, in our career, in our lives. Like, none of us can stand before God and God would go, "Wow, I'm so impressed that you lived this perfectly holy life." No, remember, our net worth is zero. Morally and spiritually, we were completely bankrupt. But here's the good news. While we were being the dishonest steward, and maybe you squandered your life, maybe you're still living in that, as that prodigal steward who's wasted the gift of life that God has given you. You would expect that God would just smite you, right? Like, if he's the almighty judge of the universe, why doesn't he just smite us? Because he's rich in mercy, Ephesians 2:4. God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in our transgressions. We had nothing to offer God, so God offered himself. And this is what amazes me when we view this parable through the lens of the gospel. God is the rich man in the parable, but he becomes the poor man from Nazareth. He's born into a manger in Bethlehem, homeless in a manger. There's no room for him in the inn. He lives his life homeless, telling his followers, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He wanders from place to place. This is God in the flesh. This is the one who was wealthy in all things in infinite degrees. And the rich man in the parable becomes the poor man for you, and even poorer, if that were possible, upon the cross. Cast out from the city, Jesus died penniless and friendless. Why? So that we could be rich in him, rich in his love, rich in an experience of friendship with him and friendship with one another for all of eternity. All of this came at great expense to the rich man who became poor for us. It all came at great expense to Jesus, who bought us at the price of his own life. But it's absolutely free to you. All you have to do is repent of your sins and believe in Jesus Christ. Have you done that? Do you need to do that again? And so we know that this parable cannot mean, it can't mean that we buy our way into heaven because we're the net worth zero steward, right? God's the rich man. He's the only one with capacity to buy our eternal salvation. So back to the original question, what does it mean that we can make friends for ourselves with unrighteous money who welcome us into eternal dwellings? To answer that question, just another illustration. This really helps me when I think about it.
I'm going to show you guys a picture. If we can pull this picture up. Some of you guys have been overseas with me and seen this. You see the guy celebrating like this? His name is Norlin Perez. I heard one of you say it because you've been with me. Yeah, this is Norlin Perez, our missionary in Cuba. And you can't see, there's people kind of all over the place. Norlin sends me these pictures about once a quarter. And about once a quarter, they will baptize literally hundreds of people who come from the 20,000 house churches that they've planted in just the last few years. In the midst of its poverty, a mighty move of the Spirit is going through Cuba right now. It is absolutely incredible. And they just can't stop baptizing. I mean, it's just all the time, hundreds and hundreds. I guess suppose it would be in the thousands every year. And so that's Norlin celebrating that. And here's what's cool. What's cool is that, Norlin has a few different churches that are supporting him. And they've got, missionaries that are going out and they're living on dirt floors. They got nothing. $30 will support them for a month. And guess what? Wellspring's their biggest supporter. You are their biggest supporter. And you know what I'm so grateful for as the pastor of Wellspring? We've got these giving statistics, and it's like, man, no Christians give anything. I tell you, we have a generous church. I'm grateful for that. But you know what? I'm not the only one who's grateful for that. Because it's not just the one who preaches the gospel who gets the credit. It's not just the one who baptizes the person that gets the credit. It's the one who funds the missionary. And every dollar you donate to Wellspring, we're sending a portion of that dollar overseas to Cuba. That means you actually get the credit. And that means that when you go to heaven one day, there's going to be a massive welcoming party for you. That's what this is talking about. When Jesus says, use your money to make friends who will welcome you into eternal dwellings, he's talking about establishing a rich welcome in the kingdom of heaven. That's what he talks about, 2 Peter 1:11. And I'm telling you, I don't want to get into heaven by the skin of my teeth. Yes, Jesus saved me. He paid the full price. But I don't want to get in like the thief on the cross who at the last minute came to know Christ. I want to give my life. I want to give my time. I want to give my money. I want to give my energy to populating heaven and depopulating hell because Jesus is worth it. When I enter into heaven, I want there to be a welcoming party of people that I have never met before. And I'm going to say, who are you? And they're going to say, that $50 you gave saved my eternal soul. And I'm going to be like, what in the world? And it's going to be multiplied so that their eternal gratitude is your eternal joy. It'll increase your joy for all of eternity. And you might be here, you're thinking, well, are you saying that like some people are going to have more joy than others if they like get more money? What are you trying to say? Here's what I would say, that in the age to come, and this issue of rewards is not commonly talked about in the church, but it is replete throughout the scriptures. Here's how I would say it. In the age to come, everyone's cup will be filled to overflowing, but faithfulness decides the size of the cup. Faithfulness is what decides the size of the cup and your capacity for eternal joy. And so part of what Jesus is saying, or what he is saying, is that with your money, he's saying be street smart. Use money to your own personal advantage. Build that massive welcoming party of friendships where their eternal gratitude becomes your eternal joy, and you get to enjoy the depths of those friendships for all of eternity. That's about as much as I can define it, because none of us have been there yet. But Jesus intends this as a motivation for generosity, for living a life that counts. So first, faithful stewards, we said, make friendships that last forever. And here's the last point. Faithful stewards earn wealth that lasts forever. Faithful stewards earn wealth that lasts forever. You see this in those last two verses, verse 11 and verse 12. Verse 11, he contrasts money that fails. Do you remember that? What does he mean by money fails? What he means is that old saying, you can't take it with you. I've never seen a U-Haul behind a hearse right? You can't. So money fails, but he contrasts that with true riches, wealth that lasts forever. There's going to be something like money and possessions in the age to come? Yeah, there is. I think some of us, we have this idea in our head that it's like you just float away to the cloud and play harps forever and ever and sing songs. And it's like, man, I prefer earth to that. Well, here's the good news. If you prefer earth, this is where you're going to live forever, if you believe in Jesus. Because our eternal future, our biblical hope is not that our soul flies away to heaven into some wispy, ethereal, harp-playing world, but that we live forever with a resurrected Jesus on a resurrected planet in resurrected bodies with all the people that your money and your words have brought to Jesus, resurrected and living together on the earth forever and ever. And so verse 11, yes, there's going to be something like money. There's going to be something like possessions. There's going to be it's going to be a bringing together, a marriage of heaven and earth. And so there will be spiritual realities, earthly realities. It's going to be fantastic. Okay? Verse 12, though, he takes it to a new level. Verse 12, I'm just going to read it again. He says, and if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? You just pause and think about that for a moment. Because right now, we're all the stewards, right? Whatever you've been entrusted with, $1, $1 million, whatever it is, it's another's. It belongs to the rich man, whatever that is. But this life is a test run for eternity. God is looking at what can He trust you with in the age to come. And He's looking at your generosity. That's the measure by which He's judging it. And if we are faithful in a little thing, and I love, by the way, that Jesus calls money a little thing. Jeff Bezos, fortune, little thing, when God has infinite wealth. Okay, and so if we're faithful with this little thing, with that which is another's, God's, He says God will entrust you with that which is your own. What does that even mean? Like, we're going to own stuff. I don't know for sure what that means, and nobody really knows for sure what it means, but I think that we can come back to that definition of ownership versus stewardship. Do you remember it? Where we said ownership is doing what you please with your money. Stewardship is doing what pleases God with God's money. Whatever ownership means, it means that we'll get to use stuff as we please. You say, well, you mean we don't need to please God? No. In the age to come, our desires will be so in line with Jesus. Our desires will be so perfect that what God desires and what we desire will be one. And so I can't tell you exactly what it means, but I can tell you that our eternal future involves ownership. And we have this life to determine what we experience in the age to come. The decisions you make with your money right now determine the size of that cup and your infinite, in the capacity of your joy. Faithful stewards earn wealth that lasts forever. I think we'll finish by returning one more time to that merchant of death, Dr. Alfred Noble. Alfred Noble's shock when he read this obituary afforded him a unique opportunity that pretty much none of us ever get. He had the opportunity to rewrite his obituary, to rewrite the way in which he would be remembered. And that's exactly what he did. He was so shaken by this article, it shook him to the core. Man, I don't want to be remembered that way. And so what he decided to do was, instead of investing my life in causing death, I'm going to invest my life in life. And he decided to leave his fortune to a charity that he started. And the purpose of this charity was to award people that benefited humanity with their discoveries and their contributions. And he left his fortune to that. And it's perpetuated to this day. And that award is perpetuated to this day, and I bet you've heard of it. It's called the Nobel Prize. Well, just like Alfred Noble, and just like this steward, you and I have a chance to rewrite the way we'll be remembered. We have a chance in this moment. This is your window of grace. This is your opportunity right now. Now you've been told, if you didn't already know it, one day all of us will give an account for our accounting. And here's the good news. If you respond, there is grace to change not only your life, but your eternal future. Let's pray.